Good afternoon and welcome to the webinar, A Shared Commitment, African-Nordic and Peace and Security Cooperation, launch of the report from the Norwegian Institute for International Affairs and the Nordic Africa Institute. My name is Anna Mutis. I'm a communications officer here at the Nordic Africa Institute. And before we start, I want to share some practical information with you. So our moderator for today's session is Cedric de Koning, research professor at the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs. And Cedric will allocate some time at the end of the session to answer questions from the audience. So if you have any question, please use the Q&A function of Zoom to share it. And if your question is directed to a specific panelist, please indicate their name. So now I would like to invite Eleanor Fisher, Head of Research here at the Nordic Africa Institute, for some welcoming remarks. Eleanor, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Anna. Excellency, professors and colleagues. On behalf of the Nordic Africa Institute, I'm delighted to welcome you to this public launch of the report, A Shared Commitment, African-Nordic Peace and Security Cooperation. I'm Professor Eleanor Fisher, the Head of Research at the Institute. Thank you for joining us. I acknowledge our distinguished audience and speakers, and thank you for making time for this event. All protocols are observed. The Shared Commitment report is the product of a dynamic collaboration with the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs, NUPI. NUPI approached the Nordic Africa Institute in 2023 to jointly produce a study about the quality and scope of Nordic Africa cooperation in the field of peace and security. We've really enjoyed this collaboration and are honoured to host this launch and to welcome Kari Osland, Director of NUPI, and her colleagues to this platform. I will soon hand over to Kari, but I wanted to set the scene a bit for those of you who do not know the Nordic Africa Institute. The Institute's mission is to provide deeper understanding among Nordic decision makers and associated change makers about contemporary African perspectives and societal dynamics. So our job is to strengthen African-Nordic relationships, and our engagements stretch across the continent. Our small team of researchers and communicators conduct knowledge generation, research and science-informed communication in more than 30 African countries. Since 2010, we've welcomed more than 100 scholars in exchange programs, varying from a few weeks to a year. We have a unique curated library, a wonderful library, containing more than 85,000 books, reports and official documents from Africa. Our 5 areas of impact range from equality to sustainability to climate and natural resources management, and obviously to peace and security. This mission and our way of working seemed ideal for the collaboration with NUPI on the project that produced the report that you're about to hear about today. The report, Shared Commitment, is an empirical overview of cooperation between the 5 Nordic countries and African states, the African Union, the regional economic communities, and civil society. It covers this cooperation, as well as themes such as women, peace and security, youth, peace and security, and African peace support capacity. Here, of course, I'm only highlighting a few areas. Perhaps what we are most pleased with is that the report also brings together African and Nordic researchers, most of whom are here today. Its production has been a truly collaborative effort and has drawn on a wide array of skills and methodologies. Above all, ultimately, it has been tailored to support policymakers and policy making. Not just today, but going beyond this webinar, we hope that it will be used to open up the space for joint reflection and dialogue on African-Nordic cooperation, and that it can set the stage for conversations about the future. Now I'd like to welcome Kari Osland, Director of the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs, and hand over to her. Thank you.
Thank you, Eleanor. Ladies and gentlemen, is there a special relationship between African and Nordic countries? Many seem to think so, and link this back to Nordic support for liberation movements in Africa and subsequent consistent support for the development of post-colonial independent states in Africa. NUPI has also benefited from and contributed to this relationship, especially through the Training for Peace program. The program, which is now in its 28th year, has created a framework for ACCORD, the Institute for Security Studies, and NUPI to assist the African Union Commission and other African institutions with support from the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. The report that we are launching today, A Shared Commitment, African and Nordic Peace and Security Cooperation, aims to analyze this special relationship by focusing specifically on the area of peace and security over the last decade. It seeks to understand the interests that drive African and Nordic relations, the themes that dominate the relationship, and the countries that have been most active. It builds on the report we published in 2022 on reimagining African and Nordic relations in a changing global order. The Nordic countries take pride in their partnership with the AU, other African institutions, and African countries. And despite our shared efforts, a number of peace and security risks persist, and new risks have emerged. These include transnational threats with global impact, such as the adverse effects of climate change on peace and security, the growing influence of new technologies, and the destabilizing effects of violent extremism. The report addresses both these persistent and new risks, and we trust that it will catalyze further strengthening of African-Nordic cooperation, and that it will encourage stakeholders in Africa and in the Nordic countries to identify both gaps and untapped opportunities for further cooperation. This report was written, as mentioned already, as a collaborative effort involving the dedicated efforts of more than a dozen African and Nordic-based researchers. The research has been led by the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs and the Nordic Africa Institute, with support from the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I want to thank Therese Sjømander Magnusson, the director of the Nordic Africa Institute, and her colleagues for the collaboration, especially in the effort that went into the design and publication of this report and the arrangements for this webinar. I wish us all a productive webinar, and with these few opening remarks, I would like to hand the screen back to my dear colleague and our moderator, Cedric de Koning.
Thank you so much, Kari, and thank you very much, Eleanor, and welcome everyone. Such a moment for us to have this opportunity to share this report with you and for you to listen to many of the contributors of the report in this webinar. My name is Cedric de Koning. I'm a research professor with the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs in our Peace, Conflict and Development Research Group. And I had the honor and pleasure of leading the project together with Angela Mavumba-Sellström, and of course also co-editing the report. So maybe just one or two quick words about the report. The aim was, of course, to map and assess the state of cooperation between Africa and Nordic, African and Nordic countries in the area of peace and security. And you will note that we have in the report case studies of all the Nordic countries, and in particular the support they are providing to Africa. And then we also have a number of thematic inputs from our colleagues in Africa, various African researchers, to give some of their perspectives on the report as well. We really hope that this report can be catalytic in identifying gaps and opportunities for further cooperation and collaboration in this area of broad area of peace and security. And part of what you will hear today, of course, is also what this area entails and encompasses, especially in the way we have delineated for this research. But we hope this report can, serve as a basis for policymakers, researchers, practitioners to identify gaps and opportunities, and that can then contribute to further refinement and enhancement of this collaboration. We had the pleasure of presenting this report at the meeting of the African and Nordic foreign ministers in October last year in Algiers. And We have also had the opportunity to share this report in Pretoria at an event hosted by the Norwegian embassy in Pretoria, where a number of other African and Nordic embassies and the South African Department of International Relations and Cooperation were present. And there will also be an event in Addis Ababa at the Swedish embassy in April. And this is part of a larger project where we have been focusing on Africa-Nordic cooperation and produced a previous report, Reimagining Nordic Africa Relations in a Changing Global Order. And we will continue with this work going forward, and also prepare and present some research at the next African-Nordic Foreign Ministers meeting, which will take place in Copenhagen in May. So that's just a snapshot of what the broader aims of this project is. And to tell you more about this specific report and its content, I'm going to hand over to Angela Mavumba-Sellström, who, as I mentioned before, has been my colleague, co-leading and co-editing this report. Over to you, Angela.
Thank you so much, Cedric, and thanks to all the participants who are attending this webinar, and thanks to Eleanor and Kari. I'm very grateful to have been able to have the opportunity to co-edit and co-lead this project with Cedric. It's been really an incredible opportunity to be part of genuine Nordic African cooperation. As you will see when you open the report, and as you will hear this afternoon, there is a real mix of Nordic and African researchers involved and engaged in this project, and we've really strived to actually place an emphasis on the idea of partnership, even though the report very much profiles Nordic contributions to the cooperation arrangements between African and Nordic states and institutions. The report covers a period of 10 years between 2012 and 2021. It has involved, as I said earlier, a mix of researchers and practitioners, 15 African and Nordic based researchers who have all extensive experience researching peace diplomacy, security sector relations, development, human rights, women, peace and security. We commissioned case study authors to look at each case, each Nordic case, and we also commissioned thematic contributing authors based mainly, but not exclusively, in Africa, to reflect on a number of thematic areas that we felt had really characterized the African-Nordic cooperation partnership in the last decade. And those areas were women, peace and security, youth, peace and security, African peace support capacity, African Union partnerships, and the Peace Fund, and peacekeeping and violent extremism. And as you will hear over and over, and you've heard today already, the report is really a map. It's an overview of the relationship and of the partnership. And the evidence base behind this map to help us fill in the map is the use of Development Assistance Committee, OECD data, which we systematically used to track and to calculate the level of commitment and the kinds of commitment that Nordic countries have made. This is really a report that sets out to give us some empirical basis for considering the continuities and the differences and similarities between Nordic countries and between different thematic areas over time. I want to stress that it isn't an evaluation or an assessment of aid effectiveness. It's not meant to do that kind of evaluation, but really to sort of set the table for future discussions and dialogues, and hopefully even future research. And if I reflect a little bit on the kind of differences we see in these patterns, when I mentioned continuities and similarities and differences, I can say that it's very hard to judge because of this kind of data that we've used. that the Nordic countries have specific areas of comparative advantage and specialization. What we can see is that they have tended to develop collaborations and partnerships at the continental, the regional, and the national level, based on their own size and their own capacity and their own networks, and that there can be some linkages between that. But the fact of the matter is, countries have all invested heavily in democracy and regional stabilization. But Denmark, for example, has done quite a lot more in the Horn of Africa and the Sahel. Finland has, as with other countries, worked with the AU, the EU, the UN, and other Nordic partners and institutions. Gender equality has been a key pillar of the support, but Iceland, for example, has done some really innovative work with WPS. Norway has used its extensive experience in peace diplomacy to work with particular peace processes like in Sudan, in South Sudan, in Somalia, and Mali. And Sweden has been very comprehensive, working quite a lot and focusing on APSA and capacity building, as well as the WPS agenda. But one of the trends we did see is that there's been a surprising amount of support for human rights and democracy and participation. There's been a kind of a much bigger support than we expected for conflict prevention and peace building. And these are the areas that have been really highlighted in the 10 years, but that have often been a bit invisible when we think about peace and security. And there's been an emphasis in previous analyses, I think, on the cooperation around peacekeeping, for example. But this relationship between African and Nordic countries has had quite a lot of traction around sort of the softer aspects of building an infrastructure for stable peace and security on the African continent. And with that, I'd like to hand over to Cedric. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Angela, for that overview. And we are now going to give some of the contributors an opportunity to share with you what their contributions and inputs were into the report. And we're going to go between the thematic and country case studies authors. And so first, we're going to turn to Hafsa Malim. Hafsa is a senior associate researcher with the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. And before she joined CIPRI, she was a partnership officer and a focal point for the AU Peace Fund with the Office of the Commissioner of Peace and Security in the Department of Political Affairs of the African Union Commission. And Hafsa, you wrote a contribution to this report that reflected on AU partnerships and the AU Peace Fund in the context of this Nordic Africa cooperation around peace and security. So please tell us a little bit more about what you included in your contribution. So over to you, Hafsa.
Thank you, Cedric, and thank you to the participants, colleagues who have worked with to put this report together. I think the snapshot of the reason and the rationale for the report has been well articulated by the colleagues who've spoken beforehand. And I want to just zoom in on why the thematic area of Nordic support to the AU Peace Fund. I think one is to establish that the Nordic support or Nordic engagement and interaction with the AU or the African Union Peace Fund is very unique. One of the reasons why this case study was selected. It gives a snapshot on the direct, indirect support, both through the lens of technical support, capacity building, i.e. through staffing as well, but also financial support that has been inbuilt into the mechanisms, but it also provides broader delivery of the peace and security agenda. And this is why this case study was unique in particular. More specifically is why is this support to the AU Peace Fund important to highlight? And it comes in twofold. One, as I said, is the nature of the support, it being more diverse, and it gives us a good opportunity to look at the lens, a broader lens of the support. But the second part is that the African Union Peace Fund, or the Revitalized Peace Fund, it's formally known, is one of the most important mechanisms on the delivery of peace and security through the African Union. And our whole idea is the revitalization since 2016 was taken against the context of trying to create autonomy for the institution, financial independence, but also agility in terms of its capacity to respond to emerging crises. And so based on this, and this discussion is from 2016, 3 windows were created in the AU Peace Fund. One is on mediation and preventive diplomacy. The second one is on capacity building. And this looks at both the liaison offices, but also the sub-regional entities, the regional economic communities. And the third is peace support operations. So what is the interaction of Nordic support to the Peace Fund? The first one, as we have talked about, is a direct support. And this is the idea that the AU Peace Fund is structured to deliver more in a more streamlined, more holistic manner on the agenda of the African peace and security architecture. Already, as it stands, Nordic support, technical and capacity building is provided through the joint financing arrangement, which is a pool of funds that is given to the AU for the delivery of this peace and security architecture, APSA, as it is popularly known as. But it's also about the direct support that the Nordic countries give to the AU to deliver specifically on this agenda. So through that support, it also then contributes to the delivery of the bigger peace and security support mechanisms as envisaged by the Peace Fund. The second aspect of it then is the more direct and indirect support, but primarily targeting the Peace Fund. On the one hand, is we assessed how the Nordic support has contributed to the delivery of the 3 windows. And that was critical because in the 3 windows are the operational mechanisms of the AU Peace Fund. In particular, if you look at window 1 on mediation and preventive diplomacy, for example, through capacity building and technical support that has been provided, for example, by the Norwegian ROSTA NORCAP, the Norwegian Refugee Council, through the Finnish Crisis Management Initiative, but also through the Training for Peace. Support has been provided to the AU liaison offices and special envoys offices in Sudan, in Ethiopia, in South Sudan, Chad, and Mali. And continued technical support has continued to be seen, especially in the delivery of peace agreements, for example, in Ethiopia as it stands. The second window on capacity building has also benefited quite a lot from the Norwegian support, but also from a more holistic Nordic support.
It looks like we may have missed Hafsat there. Maybe there's been an interruption. That was a pity because that was really interesting, Hafsa, what you were sharing with us there. About the ways that the different Nordic initiatives were contributing to both mediation, capacity building, and the 3 pillars. We know, of course, also through peace support operation, through technical support and policy development and also research. But we're going to hear more about that from the different case study countries as well. So I'm going to turn next to Fredrik Soderboom. Fredrik is a professor of peace and development research at the School of Global Studies at the University of Gothenburg. And Fredrik led the study on Sweden, or the case study on Sweden. So Fredrik, what is Sweden doing in the area of peace and security in its relationships to different African countries? Over to you.
Thank you. I'm happy to be part of this stimulating project and the webinar. Sweden does a whole lot, and I will try to raise that in 3 points. As you can see in the report, if you look at it, I did this case study together with Søren Stappel, who could not attend. Well, the first point I want to raise is that Sweden has a very comprehensive and multidimensional approach to peace and security in Africa. This is evident in that peace and security is included in no less than 15 strategies with African partner countries. It's an important part of the regional strategy with Africa, the Swedish regional strategy, and it's also part of a global strategy. And according to our definition of peace and security, there is more than 21% of Sweden's total ODA to Africa goes to peace and security. And if we look at the top 5 African recipients of Swedish aid, the relative share of peace and security is 30 to 45% of total Swedish ODA. This is for DRC, Zimbabwe, Mali, Rwanda, and Africa as a region. So the focus on peace and security is pretty comprehensive and important. However, there are big shifts in focus over time, shifts between different priority sectors and themes, and shifts between partners, African partners. So this results in that the focus is not very clear or consistent over time. I can say a few words about our data. Sometimes when you ask aid officials about how much do you support peace and security, they refer you to OECD DAC code 152, which is usually referred to as conflict, peace and security. However, this is the aid portfolio categorization. If you look what really takes place in Nordic aid, it goes far beyond this. And if we look at the Swedish portfolio, for instance, or policy rather, you can see that Swedish aid all Swedish aid should explicitly integrate the conflict perspective. It should be conflict sensitive, which means that it has to avoid doing harm. It should address root causes of conflict and also contribute to peace in various ways, positive peace and peace building. An important definition of Swedish aid is the multidimensional definition of poverty. And here, human security is a key component. So what we have done in our report is basically to look at what the Nordic countries actually do in terms of peace and security, which goes beyond the narrow code of 152. And here we have, like Angela mentioned, there is a strong emphasis in the Nordic countries on democracy, human rights, and on civil society participation as a means to contribute to peace and security. And that's what we have included. That's why we go beyond that coding. But we don't cover, for instance, environmental security in the data set, because it's often categorized as under environment. But this is very tricky about the coding. We can, if anybody is interested, we can come back to that. I move quickly over to my second point, which is that Swedish aid is defined so as to improve living conditions for poor people. And it strengthens, and it's targeted to, or aimed to strengthen the capacity of a variety of actors, especially non-state actors and organizations. The flip side of this is that Swedish aid largely bypasses the state, or seeks to strengthen the state indirectly by supporting non-state actors. Here we can see that in the same thing with Swedish support to AU and the REX, where they largely support these organizations indirectly, not directly. One possible exception to this trend can be the case of Rwanda, where there is a more developed counterpart strategy with Rwanda and strengthening of the state. Finally, my final and third point is that the relationship looks very much as a conventional and rather asymmetrical donor-recipient relationship, instead of a balanced shared commitment partnership. The first reason is that there is a strong people-centeredness or actor-centeredness, which makes it somewhat clear who is the counterpart of a so-called partnership. So is the shared commitment partnership between Sweden and Africa's people and African actors, or what? Finally, the second point I want to mention is that Sweden is basically, or Swedish SIDA, the main bilateral aid agency, is basically a manager of aid contracts. So there is a large number of executing and implementing partners and agencies at various levels. In many cases, you have an aid chain of several executing and implementing partners. And this means that SIDA as an agency is at the top here, and that sort of undermines a bit of the so-called partnership that we see. It sort of tilts the relationships in favor of a results agenda. We can discuss that more. I stop there. My time is up. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Frederick, and very interesting the issue you raise around the shift from a donor recipient to more of a strategic partnership. Let's come back to that later. Just want to flag that I think one of the reasons why perhaps it's difficult to observe when one look at the aid data is that most of the strategic, let's say, part of the relationship, of course, comes more through diplomatic cooperation, through multilateral cooperation in places like the United Nations and others, and may not be reflected in just the aid partnership data, of course. But let's come back to that later. I think that's one of the very interesting trends that we also highlighted in our previous report. And now we're going to go back to one of our thematic contributors, Martha Bakwasega, who wrote about and focused in her contribution on youth, peace and security. Martha is a senior global peacebuilding policy advisor and focal point for the Horn of African regional program at the Life and Peace Institute. Martha, over to you. Martha, can you hear us? I know she had some electricity problems earlier.
Let me begin by apologizing. We seem to be having some load shedding issues on our side at the heart of Kenya. So let me just go quickly through, as Cedric has mentioned, the focus of my contribution was on youth, peace and security in Africa. And to just begin by saying that there is no doubt that the youth, peace and security agenda has certainly gained momentum, be it globally and not simply globally, but on the African continent as well specifically. As we recognize complexities played by the youth in conflict-affected areas. I think we agree that the conflict landscape in Africa remains fluid, presenting challenges while also recognizing the role of youth in peace and security conversations, not just as perpetrators, but also as peace builders and positive influencers. And meaningful inclusion of young people in these spaces can translate into effective, sustainable solutions to the challenges that we currently face. As when we speak of the youth, we are targeting the core of our value system, the foundation. And in Africa, the youth have the ability to promote dialogue, as well as build bridges between different social groups, pivoting societies towards sustainable peace and security. But we also realize that systemic exclusion and structural barriers for youth engagement remain a reality, and ignore their role and contribution to peace and security, which translates to a missing piece of the puzzle that, if meaningfully included, would have had the ability to mobilize communities and create positive change to challenges on the African continent. And we shouldn't limit ourselves to including the youth and finding youth-led solutions to our challenges on the continent. And when I speak of limitations, we have to also recognize and applaud the continued support from external partners, such as Nordic Africa partnerships, especially as it relates to advancing local partnerships. Through local partnerships, we have witnessed amplified voices of the youth and their contribution once again in pivoting African societies towards sustainable peace and security through interventions through, for example, Norway's Training for Peace program, Denmark's Peace and Stabilization Program for the Horn of Africa, which was mentioned by Angela earlier during her introduction, and multiple initiatives by Finland, focusing specifically on their National Action Plan from 2021 to 2024, which recognizes the role of youth in the conflict spectrum. Also not forgetting the contribution by Sweden through organizations such as the Life and Peace Institute, which I represent, which has and continues to engage young people in informal settlements in Kenya. All initiatives recognize the important role played by the youth in conflict resolution and peace building. I think it's important to also note again that Nordic partnerships in Africa have centered largely on collaboration and solidarity, And the relationship has emphasized long-term, inclusive, meaningful engagement, especially when it comes to the youth. It's proved to be a trusted partner, promoting local capacity and ownership for long-term engagement. And I think, just quickly, allow me to conclude just by thanking the Norwegian Institute for International Affairs and the Nordic Africa Institute for the timely launch of this report on Nordic African cooperation, and congratulations to all the authors on sharing insights to important issues for discussions. Thank you, and over to you, Cedric.
Thank you so much, Martha. And load shedding hasn't impacted negatively on your presentation. We could hear you loud and clear. So thank you very much for that. The youth, I think, is such an important sector in the broader area of peace and security. And I think most of the Nordic countries and in the broad African-Nordic cooperation in this area, youth is one of the key priority areas that we focused on in the study and that we've identified. I noticed that we already have a number of questions, so please do keep those coming. And I noticed many of the questions that we've received so far are asking the question whether this cooperation is actually having a positive impact on reducing conflict and improving peace on the continent. And there's questions about the results framework or assessment. Do we know whether this relationship and this strategic cooperation is actually helping to reduce conflict? So those are some of the important questions being raised already, and that we will come back to, and that our contributors can also address as they go on in presenting. We're going to shift now back to one of our country cases, to Norway, and I'm going to introduce my NUPI colleague, Ingvild Brodkorp. Ingvild is a junior research fellow at NUPI, and she has been the lead author, the sole author, I should say, of the Norwegian case study. So Ingvild, over to you. Very interesting to hear what are the areas that Norway is prioritizing in its support in this area to African countries and African partners. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Cedric. I think I'll start by saying that Norway's peace and security cooperation in Africa centers around key priorities such as civilian peace building, women, peace and security, conflict resolution, climate peace and security. I mean, the list goes on, and Norway are engaged in a number of different issues. But I've decided to focus on three main aspects of Norwegian peace and security cooperation in Africa that I think is very essential to Norwegian efforts. So the first is peace, reconciliation, and support for peace processes. So Norway has over 30 years experience with peace diplomacy and has developed a lot of expertise within the areas of mediation, conflict resolution, and reconciliation that they draw upon when promoting peace and security in Africa. And that is because Norway consider peace and reconciliation as a prerequisite for preventing, reducing, and mitigating conflicts, but also to actually sustain stability efforts and ensure long-term prosperity. A typical example that's brought up when it comes to Norway's more formal role as a mediator is, of course, the peace negotiations between the South Sudan or the SPLM and the government in Khartoum back in 2006, which eventually led to the independence of the South Sudan. And Norway has kept supporting the peace processes in both these countries, and also played a supporting role in the IGAD-led peace process in South Sudan back in 2018, and continues to support the implementation of the peace agreements. But they're also supporting peace processes in other countries as well, more an informal role, but definitely helping with implementing these peace agreements, and also supporting local dialogue initiatives to, for instance, in areas with farmer and herder conflicts. Another essential aspect of the Norwegian support is, of course, the Training for Peace program. So the Training for Peace program is Norway's flagship support program to the AU Commission. And it's a unique North-South partnership between international partners such as the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs, the Institute of Security Studies, and the African Center for Constructive Resolution of Disputes, or ACORD. And TFP that contributes to strengthening the capacity of the AU Commission in managing, resolving, and preventing conflicts. And it does so by supporting the AU in enhancing its knowledge about the security and conflict environment on the continent and advancing the comprehensive range of response capacities, for instance, by generating or conducting research and analysis, but also providing policy support by facilitating platforms for peace and security actors to engage and develop policies and doctrines, but also to provide capacity or supported capacity building of police and civilian personnel that is participating in observer, mediation, and peace operations. I think in general for Norway, it is important for them to, first of all, they value their partnership with the AU a lot, and they see the strengthening of capacity and the technical expertise of the AU and other African peace and security initiatives as important in order for the AU and others to adequately respond to the peace and security challenges on the continent and ensure African ownership. And I can perhaps touch more on that later, but that also means, for instance, supporting the secondment of civilian personnel. Lastly, I want to briefly touch upon the importance of women, peace and security. Women's peace and security is at the heart of Norwegian foreign policy and guides all of Norway's peace and security efforts in Africa. Norway are, for instance, supporting to advancing the women, peace and security agenda in the AU by providing funding to the special envoy for women, peace and security, and also the FemWise mechanism, the mediation of, or the network of African female mediators. So that's some of the aspects that I think is very important to mention. And also, they also really supported efforts to include women in, for instance, the peace agreement or peace agreement and peace process in Mali. I think my time is running up, so I think it's over to you, Cedric, but I can maybe elaborate a bit more on the things later.
Thank you very much, Ingvild, and that was a very good overview of some of the areas that Norway has focused on in its relationships with and cooperation with African countries. And we're going to turn now to another Nordic country, Iceland, to hear and more about the role that Iceland is playing in this relationship. I'm going to turn to Silja Ómarsdóttir, who is a professor of international affairs at the University of Iceland, and her co-author Gudrun Fredriksdóttir, who is a senior researcher at the Nordic Africa Institute. So over to you, Silja.
Thank you, Cedric, and thank you for the initiative and especially for including Iceland in this Nordic report. It's not always that Iceland is included when studies are done of Nordic efforts, so we really appreciate that. Iceland is, of course, the smallest of the Nordic countries and as such has very limited operations in Africa. Its focus has been on supporting peace through development rather than working directly on peace and security. It has 2 embassies. The third one was supposed to open last year, but it's still, it should be getting off the ground any day now. The operating embassies are in Malawi and Uganda, and the third one will be in Sierra Leone. The focus of Iceland's work has been much more on thematic issues, which reflect foreign policy priorities, in particular gender equality, which is a pillar of Icelandic foreign policy, and specifically the Women, Peace and Security program. The examples that we took, and I want to highlight, is a project called the Grow Guest, which is a UNESCO training program, which brings fellows from low-income, conflict and post-conflict countries to Iceland for 6 months, where they get training to work on gender equality and social justice. Iceland has also supported the development of the 1325 National Action Plan in Malawi and Mozambique. And the other thematic focus, which is maybe more environmental than climate specific. Iceland's environmental focus tends to be mostly on oceanic affairs. But with regard to climate, there's another of these development projects that brings fellows from low-income countries to Iceland for training in land restoration. And 11 fellows, fellows from at least 11 countries in Africa have received such training and returned to work on land restoration in Africa. Over to you, Gunnarsi.
Thank you, Silja. So one of Iceland's strategies is focusing on its strengths thematically, but another strategy is on the secondments of individuals. And this is connected to it being a pretty extreme example of a small country, but with a well-educated population. And the strategy of these secondments is used both within general development cooperation as well as within the work on peace and security. And the expertise on these secondments is very often related, well, to, of course, to the country's thematic areas, but in particular on gender equality. It seems to be very common. And it looks like that for Iceland, this focus on one individual with a particular expertise is seen as a way to not make a too costly contribution, but which has the potential to have a great outcome or to be supportive of an even greater outcome of a cooperation. And now, since this seems to be a way Iceland likes to work and try to contribute and support, there may be a missed opportunity here with not having more cooperation with the other Nordic countries. So far, these secondments are to international organizations, NATO, OSCE, a number of UN agencies like UN Women, WFP, UNICEF, etc., rather than partnerships with bilateral projects of other countries. So to piggyback on countries that have the ability to have bigger types of cooperation projects and support, such as the other Nordic countries, but could benefit from an extra thematic specialist from Iceland, is perhaps something that could be explored further. There may be some good political reasons for why this has not been the case so far, or some bad political reasons, or perhaps it just hasn't been explored or discussed properly how Nordic cooperation could be strengthened in regards to peace and security in Africa. But this is sort of a reflection that's coming up after working on the Iceland chapter of the report. So we're just throwing it out there in the cosmos. Back to you, Cedric.
Thank you very much, Silja and Gudrun. And when we have time a little bit later to discuss and ask questions with each other, I'm really fascinated to try and understand more why Iceland chose to have embassies in Malawi, Uganda, and Sierra Leone, whereas I think many of the other Nordic countries seems to have embassies, or perhaps prioritize embassies in those countries that perhaps are seen to be more influential, the larger economies, and so on. So very interesting to understand better that focus. But first, let's move on. Now we're going to go to another thematic area, women, peace and security, which, as we've already heard from a number of the presenters, is of course a major priority area for many of the Nordic countries, maybe all the Nordic countries. So Olivia Almeida, who is a research assistant with the Nordic Africa Institute, contributed the piece that looked in more detail on the trends related to women, peace and security. Over to you, Olivia, sorry.
Thank you very much, Cedric, and thank you everyone who are joining us today. As Cedric mentioned, I will provide an overview of African-Nordic cooperation on women, peace and security, or in short, the WPS, which is a global framework that aims to address rights, agency and protection of women and girls in conflict and peace work, as many of you might be familiar with. The data in this report is drawn from the OECD database on Nordic development finance to women's rights organizations, movements, gender-focused programs, and governance institutions in conflict-affected areas. And I will also spotlight some examples of African and Nordic initiatives. The chapter has also been drafted with contributions from Angela Mavumba Sellström, our NIE senior expert on gender, women, peace and security. As you might have heard, detailed foreign policy priorities on the topic can also be found in the case study chapters. So the African Union and its member states have made considerable progress on the WPS over the years, but challenges remains with limited inclusion of women in peace processes and a continued high number of sexual and gender-based violence against women and girls in conflict-affected areas. The Nordic countries shares a commitment to inclusive peace processes, and they were also among the first countries in the world to adopt a national action plan. In fact, Denmark was the first in the world, which serves as a roadmap to oversee a state's WPS priorities. Now, how does this commitment translate to Africa-Nordic cooperation? The OECD data shows that between 2012 and 2021, the Nordic countries committed a total of $479 million to WPS in Africa, which represent 10% of the total Nordic funds for peace and security in Africa. Iceland stands out here with the largest share and Norway with the largest total amount, as you can see in the graph in front of you. These figures can be compared to UN's 15% financial earmark for gender equality and women empowerment set out in 2019, incentivizing donors to follow the lead within their own aid flows. Now, how are these funds used? The data shows that Nordic financing to WPS is multi-sectoral and covers gender equality and women empowerment more broadly, but with some greater emphasis on the participation and protection pillars, such as women and girls' increased access to decision-making, public services, jobs, democratic participation, and conflict-related gender-based violence. The largest funds goes to Nordic NGOs that work with African organizations in conflict-affected areas, with some of the top recipients being the Danish Kvinfo, Care Norway, and Swedish Kvinna till Kvinna. The second largest channel for funds is multilaterally through the UN family, and in particular UN Women, by means of supporting the implementation of national action plans in Africa. For instance, close to 70% of Iceland WPS funds and more than 60% of Finland's are delivered through UN Women. The Nordic countries have also been responsive to African initiatives and integrated with African actors. One example is their cooperation with FemWise Africa, a network of African women in conflict prevention and mediation, and a forerunner to women's mediation networks worldwide. Dialogue between African and Nordic actors, civil society activists, and policymakers endorsed the creation of a Nordic-wide mediation network. And together, with other regional women's network, they have established a global alliance, embodying a collective voice to demand women's inclusion and influence in global peace and security. Another example is Norway's earmarked funding to the African Union Special Envoy on WPS. The Nordic countries have also been forward-thinking and creative innovations. For example, the barbershop toolbox, which was created in Iceland in 2016 and has achieved international recognition for its success in involving men in the advancement of gender equality, and was first launched in Malawi in Africa. Nordics have also advocated for WPS internationally. For example, during their non-permanent membership of the UN Security Council, Norway and Sweden have taken different approaches to accelerate the integration of gender principles into reporting of UN peace operations, and by increasing the inclusion of women from civil society in briefings to the Council. Since the Council agenda inevitably addresses conflict in Africa, the integration of WPS at this level is expected to shape UN's peace and security agenda in Africa. So to conclude, Nordic engagement with Africa supports and emphasizes inclusive peace processes and the WPS agenda. Nordic nations have welcomed and supported African initiatives such as FemWise Africa, the AU Special Envoy on WPS, National Action Plan, and the civil society organizations, which all in their ways promote WPS at different levels in the society and in both regions. And I will hand it over to you, Cedric. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Olivia. I think that was such an interesting presentation, an interesting part of the report as well, because it really shows what the different aspects are within the broader women, peace and security agenda that the different Nordic countries are supporting, and what also the different elements are that the African Union and other actors in Africa are using and focusing on in this area. So a very interesting insight into the women, peace and security element of the larger cooperation. We're going to turn now to the last country that we're going to present this afternoon before we go over to discussion, and that is Finland. And to present and share with us more insights into what Finland is doing in the area of peace and security and its relationship with Africa, I'm going to hand over to Prince Dua Agiye. Prince is a doctoral researcher at the Tampere Peace Research Institute, Tampere, at the University of Tampere in Finland. Over to you, Prince. Prince, I think you're muted.
Apologies. Many thanks, Cedric. I'll just go straight forward. In the year 2021, for the first time, Finnish foreign policy emphasized Africa. So a policy towards Africa called Finland's Africa Strategy was launched to expand the relationship that Finland has with African Union, African regional economic organizations, and individual countries through equally advantageous political and economic endeavors. All these have security and peace underpinnings. Now, for two main reasons, that's why Finland is actively engaged, like its Nordic neighbors, in peace and security in Africa. First, it's Finland's role in the EU and the EU's proximity to and relation with Africa, which means that by supporting peace and security in Africa, Finland can safeguard its own security and by extension that of the EU. Second, Finland is also motivated by solidarity and shared values to assist Africa's development and stability, for example, by supporting the EU's Agenda 2063. Now, I should say that although Finland is actively engaged in the entire continent with regards to peace and security considerations, its priority areas, as of 2021, when the Finland's Africa Strategy was launched, was the Horn of Africa, the Sahel, and Libya. And these days, increasingly, Mozambique. Now, peace and security considerations for Finland takes diverse form. It includes democracy and civil society, civilian peace building, prevention of and resolution of conflict, human rights, empowerment of women and youth, and then international peacekeeping operations. I should also point out that, for example, Finnish most flagship project, arguably, in peace mediation. Mediation has been emphasized since 2010 within Finnish foreign policy setup. And not only has Finland a considerable experience within the field, but also a proven track record of success. And as a sign of its commitment, a Center for Mediation was set up in 2020 under the Foreign Ministry's Political Department to support and facilitate mediation activities. Now, other Finnish-based entities like the Matti Ahtisaari Peace Foundation and the Finchurch Aid have been quite active, supporting peace processes in different areas, from the Horn of Africa, Somalia, Sudan, Central African Republic, Libya, elsewhere, and they continue to do so. Now, the current flagship project under this African Union Mediation Support Project started in 2023, and it will end in 2026 with a budget of 4 million euros. Now, this is important in the sense that the previous engagement, we started around 2009, was quite beneficial. It led to, among other things, for example, the establishment of the AU Network for African Women in Conflict Prevention and Mediation, which established FemWise Africa, the provision of AU high-level mediation deployment, the establishment of annual high-level retreat special envoys and mediators, as well as the development of mediators, among other things. So this current project, in the long run, is expected to not only build on the previous one, but also to enhance the AU's ability to prevent resolve and to resolve conflict in timely, sustainable, and inclusive manner. And the project, which has specific emphasis on youth engagement, is being represented by CMI, which is the Matti Ahtisaari Peace Foundation, as the implementing partners for Finland. And in addition to this continental engagement, Finland is also still actively working with individual organizations like ECOWAS and CO, as well as also countries. And a typical example would be for the signing of peace mediation agreement with South Africa last year in April. So that is pretty much what Finland is engaged in. I'm happy to come back to any questions in the future, but I have to hand over to Cedric.
Thank you so much, Prince, and thank you for all our contributors. I'm sure, as everybody could hear, there's a lot of content in the report, and as you know, that's freely available. And if you have not yet seen it, I would encourage you to have a look at those areas that you are interested in. We have now reached a point where most of our contributors have given you a bit of an insight into the specific sections that they have worked on in the report. And we're going to take a few minutes to discuss, to ask a couple of questions. Firstly, I would say among the different contributors, and then we're going to open up to the overall questions also that we can get from those of you who are listening in. And a couple of those questions have already been posed in the Q&A, and I would really encourage any of you who have a question to please go ahead and post it onto the Q&A as well, so that we can try and respond to that. And I noticed that some of them have also been, there's also already some answers given in the Q&A as well. So have a look at that and do engage with us. But maybe the first thing I wanted to go back to some of our contributors and see who has an idea. But what I wanted to ask you is to consider by looking at the different, especially the different Nordic countries and the areas that they have been working on in the area of peace and security, what would we say are some of the most important differences between the Nordic countries, between the areas that they have selected to focus on? I think there's been a lot of, there's a lot of similarities as well. We've highlighted that, you know, all of the Nordic countries have a focus on women, peace and security, on mediation, on many are contributing to peace operations. But what would be some of the important differences and reasons for those differences between the different Nordic countries? These countries are, of course, not homogeneous either. They may come from a shared region, and we think we have some shared identity among the Nordic countries, but they also have their own particular interests and priorities. So that will be very good to hear from our different country case study authors, if you have a view on this. I'm going to maybe turn first to Frederick and then see if there's anybody else who would like to comment on that question as well. Over to you, Frederick.
Yes, thank you. Very interesting presentations and also questions and so on. I think as we have heard from the presentations, there is pluralism and diversity of all the countries, and it's not always difficult to draw very clear comparisons of differences. But one thing that strikes me is that in official policy, Sweden and Norway, for instance, say they want a partnership with the AU and the REX. And as we heard from one of the presentations, Sweden supports the AU Peace Fund, for instance. And we have certain support to AU Peace and Security Council. But there is quite a distinct difference, at least in my reading, between how Sweden, for instance, engages in a partnership with AU and the REX, where the Norwegian approach is very long-term and very committed. It has this training for peace, which whereby it supports AU both directly and indirectly, and it has staff secondments to the AU headquarters, whereas in contrast, Sweden works primarily through other implementing agencies and partners, and with much less support directly to AU and the REX, and for instance, support civil society organizations in West Africa and so on in order to strengthen peace. Now that can be a good project goal, but in spite of similar goals, the strategies are very dissimilar. Stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Frederick. That was quite interesting. And I of course, have been involved in the Training for Peace program. And I mean, one of the things that I think is very interesting to note there is that it's really a kind of a north-south-south project. So it's Norwegian funded to my institution, the Norwegian Institute for International Affairs, but then also to African organizations, Accord and ISS. And so you have this south-south capacity building and support and technical expertise funded by Norway. And I think that also makes for a kind of an indirect but very interesting initiative, because I think over the years there's also been a lot of capacity building of then African civil society, African think tanks, African NGOs in this area, even although the main focus was on the African Union, of course. If there's any other colleagues who would like to come in on this question, please do raise your hand as well. The other question I had that I mentioned earlier to Celia and Gudrun is if you have an explanation for why Iceland have chosen to have embassies and engagements with Malawi, Uganda, and Sierra Leone, as opposed to some of the largest economies in Africa. To me, that seems quite a very interesting selection of countries. Do you have any comments or explanation on that?
Well, not a formal policy-based analysis, but Iceland has the policy, especially the development policy of Iceland, is to work with the least developed countries. So the focus is because Iceland's economy is so small, any contribution would not be very relevant in larger countries. So working, for example, in Uganda on fisheries in the lakes is a contribution that makes a significant impact. So that's been the logic, is that the collaboration makes the most has the biggest impact relative to the money that we have to spend and number of people we can contribute to development projects. Maybe Gudrun wants to add something.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think Celia has summed it up. It's not a coincidence that we are in the smallest country. It's a strategy to be sort of not where there's a lot of other actors, and to focus on specific areas even within the countries. Like at least in Malawi, Iceland's not in the whole country. It chooses a smaller area and then manages to do a lot in that very small part of Africa.
That's very interesting, how a relatively small country like Iceland is, adopting this particular strategy to try and maximize its contribution in this area. Thank you very much. Angela, I see you raised your hand. Did you want to come in on the issue about the differences?
Yes, yes, thank you so much, Cedric. I think actually a lot of it has been said. I wanted to actually highlight that there is some interesting variation in that some countries really seem to have a closer association with their cooperation around their own comparative advantage or their own kind of engagement in the world. So Denmark, for example, is such a large, one of the world's largest shipping countries in the world. It's invested peace and security cooperation and anti-piracy. Just as the Iceland example around fisheries makes sense for Iceland's economy. I think that's interesting. I think it's more difficult to find these specializations with larger partners like Sweden or Norway, because I think the cooperation is so diversified for Sweden and Norway. But I also agree with Frederick that it's very interesting to see the kind of differences in time horizon that the cooperation has had, and the kind of engagement around capacity building, for example, or seconding officers or seconding staff has been, to my mind, and having looked at these different case studies extensively over time, has been much more of an emphasis for Norway than for Sweden. And I think that that's just a sort of interesting choice. I also think that Swedish support to women's organizations and to human rights work and governance work is also kind of another aspect that doesn't come out as vividly, say, with Finland. But again, one would guess that the specialization is driven by, or the differences is driven by, first, each Nordic country's own kind of geographic or economic DNA, and then secondly, if they all had the same level of resources and the same number of funds to distribute, I think there would be less differences. I think there would be much more similarities if they didn't have to pick and choose so much.
Thank you for that very interesting analysis, Angela. I'm noticed that our colleague Jacob Dreyer has joined us who contributed on the Denmark study. So I'm going to ask him a question about that. And then I'm going to go to Hafsa because she was interrupted earlier. And I want to just check if there was something more that she wanted to say, especially about capacity building and the peace support operations pillars of the Peace Fund. And then we're going to address the questions that have been raised in the Q&A. So if you do want to add any more questions, please do so. But Jacob, Jacob is a postdoc, recently finished his PhD at the University of Copenhagen, and he has contributed the section on Denmark. Jacob, in 3 minutes or so, could you tell us a little bit about maybe what distinguishes the Danish engagement in the area of peace and security? And although climate action and support for climate action has been covered in most of the reports, I don't think we've mentioned that a lot earlier. So I know this is also one of your area of specializations. If you can say a little bit about what Denmark is doing in this area. So over to you, Jacob.
Thank you very much, Cedric. I really appreciate this opportunity. And sorry for being late. I sort of ran straight from a lecture to a whole 300 students. But yeah, thanks so much for letting me be here. And I would propose 3 main characteristics that I really think makes Denmark stand up and sort of makes for an interesting comparison with the other Nordic countries. So first of all, I'm aware that this is also a sort of shared characteristic with especially Norway and Sweden. Denmark has been involved in this area for 60 plus years. So Denmark has a very sort of long-term and sustained involvement in several countries across the African continent, and Denmark really emphasizes and does so increasingly. Denmark is right now actually developing a new Africa plan, where it really highlights the importance of strengthening and developing equal partnerships with its African partners across the continent. Then secondly, I would stress that Denmark increasingly emphasizes crisis management. So although Denmark is of course still very much a development actor, it's increasingly emphasized and try to develop tools to really sort of find new pathways to ensure sort of crisis management and also longer term crisis prevention efforts. It does so especially through what is called the Peace and Stabilization Fund, which is sort of a unique tool and fund in the Danish sort of foreign policy toolbox, which is based on collaboration between the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Ministry of Defense, the Ministry of Law, and then finally the Prime Minister's office. to really try to develop more sort of comprehensive efforts that especially focusing on crisis management and with a willingness historically to also use military actors as part of a wider sort of engagement. In the past, Denmark had a greater emphasis on having its own sort of boots on the ground across the continent, especially in Mali. But since we've seen sort of the developments in Mali and other countries in the Sahel region, Denmark increasingly emphasizes working with local partners, especially in East Africa, where a country like Kenya is an important partner, but also in the coastal countries of Western Africa, for instance, in Ghana, and also possibly in Côte d'Ivoire in the coming years. And then lastly, based on what your question was, Cedric, about sort of the role of climate action in its efforts. Denmark sort of has climate action as its sort of foreign policy flagship. And certainly it tries to also integrate climate action into its peace and security efforts. For example, in Somalia, it's trying to develop a sort of novel initiative that sort of is based on collaborations with the UNIP as well as the Berghof Foundation to really use climate action, especially adaptation efforts, as part of sort of post-conflict reconstruction and development efforts. So I think that's worthwhile emphasizing and worthwhile seeing in the context of Denmark's wider sort of climate engagement, where it really tries to push the green transformation in many countries across the African continent. Thank you for the word.
Thank you very much for that, Jakob. And as I mentioned, I'm going to go to Hafsa next. Hafsa, as you expand on what you started saying earlier before you were interrupted about the Peace Fund and the indirect support in some of the pillars, I wonder if you can also start reflecting on some of the questions that we've received, because as you've noticed, one of the questions was, whether this capacity building that is part of this cooperation is actually having an effect. Is the capacity for peace and security increasing in Africa at the African Union? Another question was, how much is this capacity, if it is increasing, actually leading to improved peace and security on the African continent? So maybe that's some of the questions that you could also try to start to reflect on when you talk about support, Nordic support also to the Peace Fund. So over to you, Hafsa, and then we'll open up questions and answers more to everybody.
Thank you, Cedric. And my apologies, I'm actually in the field, so the connection is not the strongest, but we'll try to make do. I think just working backwards as to the diverse approaches of the different Nordic countries and the support that is provided and linking that to capacity building, I think it's worth highlighting that most of the nature of the support that is provided is also actually at the request of the African Union. So in the case of the African Union, so the divergent approaches sometimes is we would prefer to have direct support on issues of 1 to 3, and on others, because of the extensive, I would say, bureaucracies and sometimes the challenges of also dispersing funds and accessing technical capacities, then request is made for it to then be channeled through third-party institutions. Then this helps facilitate some of the engagement. And it is some of that thinking that has also led to some of the support that I was mentioning, for example, in the Peace Fund, not just talk about the capacity building aspect, but also the technical or the strategic technical capacities that this institution provides. So, for example, the training for peace in particular and the peace support operation window of the Peace Fund, but also the operationalization of the Peace Fund. And the role that that program played was quite important, both in terms of contributing to strategic communications, outreach, sensitization of member states, and in particular on what has now become the landmark adoption of the financing for peacekeeping operation, for African-led peace support operations by the UN Security Council. And a lot of this work leading on sort of the conditionalities that were given by the Security Council in 2016 to 2018, including in drafting issues on compliance, human rights, I would say issues around command and control, were also provided by, by the Training for Peace team. And so the strategic support that was provided was quite crucial. And this was at the request of the African Union. So linking that to the last question, does this have impact on the ground? Perhaps what we have not done is quantified the support and the direct impact that it has had. But however, when you do look at the quantity of work that has been delivered, the entire operationalization of the Women Network, FemWise, for example, the delivery and full operationalization of the Peace Fund, of which I was there when it happened, and the support that we received from the technical institutions, the work that CMI, LPI has done, for example, on the AU program, border program, and the operationalization of what became the African border, governance reports, for example, and programs that have now led to a lot of the work that is being done in capacity building in border areas, especially at a time when interstate conflict on the African continent is on the rise. So when you look at the emerging crises, you look at an organization that is overstretched, not just in terms of technical capacity, in terms of warm bodies, but also in terms of reach and agility to respond. And you look at the nature of support that these institutions are providing, then I think the math adds up. So whilst it has not necessarily been, I would say, documented, and maybe that should be the next step, is to actually look at the facts and figures. But one last thing I would like to highlight also is now looking ahead and in terms of what more can be done, because there's always room for more to be done, especially in the Peace Fund. Now that we have, reached a point of operationalizing the fund, and, an initial 5 million has been endowed to what is the agile funding window, the crisis reserve facility, the next step is an opportunity for partners to also directly contribute to this agile window, which will then contribute to two things, which is the independence of the African Union in terms of trying to respond more quickly to emerging crises, but also exactly that aspect, the agility. So what we were trying to avoid is how to move around in terms of accessing funds, especially when it comes to preventive diplomacy in crisis context. So I think that those are the two things I would wish to reflect on, is to just mostly emphasize that this is also need-based and also at the request of the institution. So it's not something that is perhaps imposed, but more of a request most of the time. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Hafsa. And I just want to also ask the other panelists, since we only have a few minutes left, and we won't be able to everybody to have a chance to spend a few minutes to answer some of these questions. Please also do answer the questions in the Q&A to the various colleagues that have asked questions there. Maybe from my side as well, I want to reflect on the questions, because I think it's really important questions. Has capacity been developed as a result of this cooperation? And how much is that contributing to increased peace and security in Africa? And to what degree is the Nordic contribution responsible for that increased capacity, if there is? I mean, I would just say from my own experience, I was first posted to Addis Ababa in 1994. And if I look at the state of the OAU and the capacity of the OAU at that point, and if I look at the capacity of the African Union and other regional economic communities today, I do think there has been significant capacity that has been built over this last 20, 25 years or so. For instance, in the area of peace support operations, if I think back at the start of the Training for Peace program in 1996, that around 1998, the African Union decided, or the OAU at that point, decided to invest in building African peace support operation capacity. And today, the African Union has deployed over 20 different peace operations in places like Somalia and Mali and Gambia, and currently have also, for instance, an observer mission in Tigray and Ethiopia. So I do see increased capacity and increased agency in many of these areas. Also, if you think back 10, 15 years ago, if there was a conflict in Africa, most likely we would have seen, a Western mediator or a United Nations special envoy. And most of the conflicts today are being the primary actors managing those conflicts are African mediators and African institutions. So I do definitely see increased capacity. The question about to what degree this is, improving peace and security in the continent is, of course, a very complex one, because as this capacity has grown over the last 20, 25 years, we have also seen major changes in the globe in terms of the international war on terror, the climate change, the current global power rivalry. And we've seen worldwide an increase in conflicts, not just in Africa. And I think what is happening in Africa at the moment is also part of that global trend, despite the fact that on the one hand, we have this investment and increase in peace and security capacity. We also see overall a trend towards a more turbulent and uncertain world, which we need to take into consideration. And I think, of course, we have chosen to focus in this report on the Nordic Africa cooperation and map that out. But of course, I don't think anyone claims that the Nordic contribution is the major or most important part of this relationship with Africa. Many, many other countries across the globe have, of course, made similar contributions as well. So that was just some of the responses I had to the questions asked. Thank you very much for them. Is there any other colleague who would like to take the floor as well and would like to respond to some of those questions? Angela, yes, I was just going to say I don't see everybody's hands because I only see a few hands up. Angela, please, over to you.
Sure. I cannot answer all of the questions as well as they deserve. They really merit a proper answer. And I appreciate that Frederick has been responding in the answer live stream. I just wanted to reflect upon this question of efficacy, or how I think there's a lot of people who wonder, well, what has been the net impact of this cooperation? Given the fact that we do see conflict, we continue to see conflict and even resurgence. And some would even argue, I think, that there are more difficult conflicts now ongoing on the continent than previously. But I do think that this report was not meant to evaluate the impact. I mean, that requires a different set of research questions, a different set of methodologies, a different set of, a whole host of other things. And two, I would like to just sort of note that the fact that there is this cooperation doesn't necessarily mean that you would see less conflict. I think what the causes of conflict may not be the same as the causes of peace. So what this cooperation has done is really, I think, lay a kind of a vast network of agency and institutional cooperation and capacity at different levels and in multiple ways and across a whole range of areas. I don't think it's enough. And I think that I would argue that perhaps what we need is more actors to engage in the similar type of cooperation. And there we might see a much more critical shift in the peace capacity on the continent. But I do agree with you, Cedric, there is a huge difference between even 10 years ago and today in terms of engagement and activity, and also leadership from the African side around peace and security issues.
Thank you so much, Angela. Jacob, I see your hand, but unfortunately we've run out of time. So I just want to thank all the colleagues who have contributed and everyone who has posted questions. I think it was really important questions, and I do hope that we can continue to engage on those. But now I would like to hand over to Teresa Schomander Magnussen, who's the director of the Nordic Africa Institute, to say some few closing remarks. Over to you, Teresa.
Thank you so much, Cedric. And first of all, please excuse my late arrival. I was in a briefing with the State Secretary actually on the challenging situation in West Africa. So I've really appreciated being part of the last 45 minutes, a fascinating combination of presentations and conclusions. But Excellencies, professors, and colleagues, I'm very pleased to be able to close this highly interesting and informative seminar, and perhaps most importantly, to express our collective appreciation for the opportunity to hear both from the authors of the report, A Shared Commitment on African-Nordic Peace and Security Cooperation, but also I'd like, on behalf of the Nordic Africa Institute team, to thank the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs. And we would like especially to thank Kari Olsland, the director of NUPI, and Professor Cedric de Koning, who has worked so closely with us during the course of developing the report. Together, we have been able to bring you the report and the webinar, and the collaboration has helped us to take stock of African-Nordic cooperation in the area of peace and security over the past decade. Thank you to all the panelists for your contributions, not just in the report, but in the summing up of a very complex evidence, case studies, thematic viewpoints, and above all, for trying to give some nuance to the diverse ways in which the peace and security for Africa in Africa by Africans has been supported by the Nordic countries. I'm quite aware that there are many more questions and opportunities ahead for further reflections and dialogue. While we have gained deeper insights into the specific focus areas, the world and the nature of partnership is also evolving. And this report has underscored that building peace and security is not limited to a single actor or entity, that it takes place at the local, regional, national, and multilateral levels, that it includes broad-ranging institution building and normative framework, as well as more tactile, locally rooted engagement to level the playing field for women and men. We learned also that Nordic countries have had unique approaches of collaboration across the conflict resolution spectrum, and that there is both a historical background to the cooperation with Africa, but also a turning point as new threats need new innovations, such as, for example, the climate crisis. All these point towards the need for more dialogue and cooperation of new partnerships that span human and traditional security threats. Thank you to the editors and the authors for your efforts, and to the Nordic Africa Institute team that organized this event. Thank you to all who supported the project, most especially the Norwegian Foreign Ministry, and thank you to NUPI for our collegial and productive cooperation. Finally, thanks again to the audience of leading experts and practitioners for your time and attention. We hope you will be able to use this report to start new conversations and explore how best to build better institutions and more resilient capacities towards inclusive, sustained peace and prosperity in Africa. Colleagues, a warm thank you and goodbye.
Thank you very much, and goodbye, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Hope you have a good rest of the day wherever you may be. Thank you so much.